It's hard to think of a city that's more designed around the automobile than Los Angeles, California. But this reputation isn't new by any means. LA has embraced this way of life since the invention of the automobile itself. With the advent of freeways and a rapidly growing population in the mid-20th century, LA's traffic problems were reaching a breaking point. For many people, the solution to this problem was monorail. And over the course of 15 years, Los Angeles would engage in a heated battle over this idea. An idea that lay somewhere between science fiction and reality. Perhaps one of the great ironies of LA's history is that the city and its sprawling suburbs were originally developed around mass public transit. The Pacific Electric Railway was formed in 1901 by railroad magnate Henry E. Huntington. In the coming years, his trolley network would expand to a staggering scale. At its peak, the Pacific Electric operated well over 1,000 miles of track across 4 counties. But the famous red cars weren't simply a means of transit. They were a convenient way for Huntington to bring people to his real estate developments across Southern California. Dozens of communities sprung up along these routes and soon developed into thriving cities. Believe it or not, these early days of LA's history also saw a surprising number of proposals for monorail systems. In fact, the idea was suggested as early as 1887. The Enos Electric Railway had been built a year earlier in Greenville, New Jersey, demonstrating one of the earliest concepts for a suspended monorail. A Los Angeles man acquired the rights to build a full-scale version of the system, which he planned to build from Pasadena to either Santa Monica or Long Beach. However, a full-scale public monorail would not be built for over a decade, and it would be halfway around the world. Germany's Wuppertal-Schwebebahn opened in 1901, connecting several small villages along the Wupper River. This system not only proved itself to be incredibly safe and reliable, but it was decades ahead of its time. As such, this general design would serve as the basis for most other monorail concepts over the next half-century. For instance, engineer P.S. Combs proposed a similar styled monorail for LA in 1927. This would glide over the city streets at 150 miles per hour. His proposed system would run from Venice and Culver City to downtown Los Angeles. Whether this idea was practical was anyone's guess. But car ownership in LA was seeing its first explosion in the 1920s, and traffic was already becoming a severe problem. The Venice Evening Vanguard wrote, "Any transportation plan affording relief from the interlocking congestion of automobile and rail surface traffic would capture immediate recognition." But with the Great Depression arriving shortly after, any hopes of a sprawling transit system would be postponed for several years. Combs would eventually promote the idea again over a decade later in 1939. This time he suggested the monorail could run between the San Fernando Valley and downtown Los Angeles. 2 route options were suggested, either following the Los Angeles River through Burbank, or running down through Cahuenga Pass in Hollywood. While some people praised the idea, others weren't convinced. A writer for the Redondo Reflex commented, "When I first came to California, I was told that this state had more unfinished and half-baked, harebrained schemes than any other part of the country, and I guess it still holds good. The climate here attracts all kinds of schemers and promoters, as well as all kinds of suckers for them to work on." Despite the criticism, a committee of public leaders gave Combs' proposals some careful study. but they eventually dismissed the idea a year later, citing it as visually obtrusive and too expensive. Many other engineers and inventors would promote their own versions of this idea throughout the early 20th century. But most of these ideas had little basis in reality, or in the very least, they were simply impractical. The general public recognized this, and none of these ideas were taken very seriously. The traffic issues in Los Angeles only accelerated after World War II. Wartime industries had brought in so many new people that the city's population rose dramatically in just a few years. Post-war America also ushered in a huge spike in car ownership that was never seen before, and people were moving out to the suburbs in droves. This cultural shift was happening all over the country, but it was even more pronounced in LA, which was already so much more spread out than other major US cities. And with these greater distances to travel, owning a car was practically a necessity. By the late 1940s, work was underway on a network of modern freeways that would serve drivers throughout the county. But despite the progress of highway engineers, many people understood that freeways couldn't be the only solution. The LA Times wrote, "It doesn't appear this maze of concrete ribbons will handle the problem, along with the continuing insurge of new residents and vehicles. Yet the planners are already contemplating a parallel set of freeways to supplement those that haven't yet been built." Contrary to what many people think, Los Angeles cannot continue to depend upon automobiles as its principal mode of mass transportation, nor on buses, if it expects to keep on growing. The demand for rapid transit was growing not only with the general public, but with community leaders and politicians as well. Chamber of Commerce President B.O. Miller said, "We must provide a law which will permit the organizing and financing of rapid transit facilities. Unless we act with the utmost speed, the transportation situation here will approach chaos. But this thing is worth fighting for, and we intend to see this fight through." In 1948, another local man named George Roberts started promoting his vision for a monorail. And this time, city and county officials took the idea much more seriously. Roberts proposed that a high-speed monorail system could cut the city's travel times in half. Unlike streetcars and buses, a monorail could glide over the roads and never be slowed down by traffic. He envisioned a network of 3 transit lines emanating from Los Angeles Union Station. These would run 9 miles up to Pasadena, 21 miles up to Van Nuys, and 22 miles down to Long Beach. The idea was that this monorail would be suspended over the Los Angeles River, as this would minimize any impact on neighborhoods and city streets. The system would be funded entirely by private capital, and would be privately owned and operated. While this offer was certainly enticing, there was just one problem. The people of Los Angeles hadn't had the best experience with privately owned transit. Case in point, the Pacific Electric Railway had been in serious decline for decades, and by 1950 it was in shambles. Their aging streetcars were painfully slow and unreliable. Some of these were scrapped in favor of buses. Other transit routes were just abandoned entirely. And all the while, the company was jacking up the prices for its riders. To say the people of LA were fed up with the Pacific Electric would be putting it very politely. Meanwhile, another streetcar operator, Los Angeles Transit Lines, had been dealing with its own controversy. They had recently been bought out by a corporation with ties to General Motors and the Standard Oil Company. Streetcars were soon being scrapped at an alarming rate and replaced with buses, much to the benefit of these corporations. The case was taken to federal court, laying the groundwork for one of the most infamous conspiracies in LA's history. But in fact, this modernization was happening on a much broader scale. Transit companies saw buses as more modern, reliable, and versatile than streetcars. Unfortunately, these new buses only added to the city's pollution and congested streets. Having seen the dark side of privately owned transit, the people of LA demanded that any new rapid transit system should be accountable to the community at large. The idea of a publicly owned transit company had been discussed for over a decade, but no real progress had been made. One resident wrote in a letter to the LA Times, "The main reason for inaction is the red-taped inertia of the city administration. Clear out the cobwebs and get on the ball, Los Angeles. Take the lead in something which will fire the people's imagination." In 1951, politicians did fire up the people's imagination in the best way they knew how, with a legislative bill. This bill would establish the Los Angeles Metropolitan Transit Authority, or MTA. This agency would be responsible for studying and developing a monorail transit system for Los Angeles. Any future construction would be handed to a private company, but the monorail system itself would be publicly owned and operated. The MTA bill was signed into law by California Governor Earl Warren on July 24, 1951. For the first time in the city's history, a new era of rapid transit was finally within reach. With the MTA now established, there was much work to be done. As one of his first priorities, Chairman Martin Pollard set off for a business trip to Europe. There he would meet with groups in 4 countries that were developing monorail technologies of their own. George Roberts soon took off for a similar trip of his own to form business partnerships with some of these same groups. While he technically wasn't guaranteed to build the LA system, he did share a close partnership with the MTA, and was assumed to be the future contractor. One of the obvious tour stops was the Wuppertal monorail in Germany. By this point, it had been operating for 50 years with a virtually spotless safety record. Martin Pollard also paid a visit to Scotland. Here he witnessed the short test track for the Benny Railplane, a unique concept for a propeller-driven transportation system. Meanwhile, George Roberts attended a special unveiling of a new monorail concept in Cologne, Germany. Unlike most other monorail designs up to this point, this sleek test train was wrapped around the top of the track rather than suspended underneath it. This experiment was the brainchild of Swedish industrialist Dr. Axel Wenner-Gren, who would soon develop a company called Allweg to further develop this technology. When Martin Pollard returned from his trip a few weeks later, he said, "I am more than ever convinced that monorail is the solution for the problem of mass rapid transit. With the engineering studies and thought that has been given to it, the modern conception of monorail far exceeds anything this country has yet seen." Despite the growing enthusiasm, the monorail wasn't without its opponents. Many politicians were skeptical that it would be practical or affordable, especially on the massive scale needed for Los Angeles. Would it really be fast enough to entice people out of their cars? Would it earn enough revenue to support itself? To answer these questions, the MTA began a comprehensive engineering study to confirm whether the monorail was economically feasible. This was a critical step in the process, as it would take the monorail out of the science fiction books and put some real-world data behind their decisions. The results of this study were presented in February of 1954, and confirmed that a system like this would indeed be feasible. Rather than a Y-shaped network above the LA River as proposed by George Roberts, they recommended a single end-to-end route running above the city streets. The study found that while running over streets would be a little more expensive, it would also put the transit line closer to the population centers, making it more convenient and attracting more riders. On the north end, the monorail would start in Panorama City, heading down to Van Nuys and then over to North Hollywood and Studio City. It would then run through Cahuenga Pass along the middle of the Hollywood Freeway. This would use a strip of land that had recently been abandoned by the Pacific Electric Railway. From here it would enter Hollywood, and then turn east to run above Sunset Boulevard for the next 6.5 miles. As it approached downtown, the monorail would dip into a 2-mile-long tunnel, and serve a couple of stations underground. After emerging from the tunnel, it would run farther down to Southgate, Linwood, and Compton. Then it would make the final approach to the southern terminus in Long Beach. The monorail would serve 17 stations along this 45-mile route, with a projected ridership of 80 million passengers a year. For those traveling end-to-end, the monorail would be 30 minutes faster than driving a car, and a full hour faster than riding a bus. The report found that such a system can be constructed for far less cost than additional freeways for automobiles, and can carry with comfort more people than a 6-lane freeway. The cost was estimated to be $165 million, or about $1.7 billion today. The construction would be funded by private investors, who would then be paid back over a 20-year period through the system's revenues. The monorail itself would be owned and operated by the MTA, making it a publicly owned transit system that wouldn't cost the taxpayers a dime. This was all very promising, but there was just one caveat. The monorail could only financially support itself if the MTA didn't have to pay taxes on it. It was actually fairly common for public agencies to be tax-exempt, so amending the law to allow this should have been straightforward. And it might have been, if it wasn't fiercely opposed by the city's two biggest bus companies, Metropolitan Coach Lines and Los Angeles Transit Lines. As private enterprises, both of them operated under heavy taxation, which had cut severely into their profits. The LA Mirror pointed out that they see monorail as a deadly competitor. Both have lines operating which almost parallel the proposed Valley to Long Beach monorail line. If monorail is all it's claimed to be, such a line might put their paralleling lines out of business. Unsurprisingly, the bus companies were outraged by this, and lobbied heavily against the MTA's efforts. They also started attacking George Roberts personally. For the last several years, he had promoted his company as the only one capable of building the monorail. He had also been selling highly speculative stock in his company, based on his connections with the MTA. With the potential scandal on their hands, the MTA quickly distanced themselves from George Roberts. While he would continue promoting the monorail in other cities like San Francisco, he would never return to the Los Angeles project. The political debate over the MTA's authority would wage on for months. But by March of 1955, a new idea emerged that would change everything. Rather than being a competitor, the MTA could take ownership of the two bus companies, merging them into a single publicly owned transit system. This would be tax-exempt just like the monorail. The bus company executives were immediately on board with this idea. But of course, this would create a whole new wave of political controversy that would carry on for another couple of years. Eventually, the MTA was successful in getting its expanded powers in May of 1957. This made them the new operator of a massive citywide bus network. But they also now had the tax exemption they needed to build a successful rapid transit system. What the MTA didn't know was that a monorail would be built sooner than they realized, and it would take the world's imagination by storm. But it wouldn't be in Los Angeles. It would be right in their backyard. In nearby Anaheim, Disneyland had been operating for nearly 2 years at this point. The park had been a resounding success, and was the crowning achievement of Walt Disney's creative genius. In many ways, it was also a showcase of his obsession with transportation. Among other things, the park had 4 different train rides and 3 different versions of the Autopia. But one of Walt's earliest visions for the park was conspicuously missing: a futuristic monorail. There's a few different accounts of how this all developed, but the most popular version goes like this. Walt and his wife Lillian had ridden the Wuppertal monorail in the early 1950s. The swinging of the suspended ride made Lillian queasy, and Walt wasn't impressed with the imposing design of the overhead structures. This was hardly the train of tomorrow that he envisioned, so he put the idea on the back burner for a couple of years. On a second trip to Germany in 1958, while driving through the countryside near Cologne, something unusual flew overhead and caught them by surprise. In this bit of lucky timing, Walt had stumbled upon the new test track of the Allweg monorail system. In the years since George Roberts had witnessed Allweg's first experiments in 1952, the company had refined its technology and built the second full-scale test track. This monorail was far more modern than the Wuppertal one, and Walt soon partnered with Allweg to develop a monorail for Disneyland. The company's founder, Dr. Axel Wenner-Gren, had actually visited Los Angeles in 1954 and promoted his system to the County Board of Supervisors. He told them, "I drove around your city and I saw that you are in great need of swift and safe passenger transportation. We already have such a system as you need, operating on an experimental basis between Cologne and Dusseldorf in Germany." His presentation didn't gain much traction at the time, but now 4 years later, Allweg was getting a chance to build its first demonstration in the United States, and it was just a stone's throw from Los Angeles. When these plans were announced to the public, Disney engineer Roger Broggie said, "This will be a demonstration of the Allweg system for all of America. Los Angeles and San Francisco need a monorail too. We believe that our Allwegbahn will be able to provide a good example for those cities." And thanks in large part to the design work by Disney legend Bob Gurr, the monorail would be colorful, eye-catching, and futuristic. Funny enough, Gurr would later give his 2 cents to the LA Times and say that the MTA was studying and talking the issue to death, rather than getting a move on with their own transit system. While the monorail was being developed for Disneyland, a similar project was being proposed in Seattle, Washington. The city was looking to build a mile-long monorail system as part of its upcoming World's Fair in 1962. The Century 21 Exposition would be a celebration of the future, with an emphasis on space-age technology and design. 2 aircraft manufacturers from the LA area, Lockheed and Northrop, submitted designs for the Seattle monorail contract. Both concepts took inspiration from their background in aircraft design. Lockheed would soon be named the contractor for the Seattle project. Naturally, both companies were eager to present their designs to the MTA as well, with the hopes that they could win the much larger contract for the Los Angeles system. Likewise, Walt Disney personally invited the MTA and LA County supervisors to come visit Disneyland and inspect the Allweg monorail that was nearing completion. When they paid a visit, they were very impressed with what they saw. County Supervisor Frank Bonelli said, "The monorail type of rapid transit is no longer something that exists on the drawing boards or in a dream. It's actually a reality, and if we act now, we can soon be well on the way to a solution of our mass movement traffic problem." On June 14, 1959, Disneyland broadcasted its special preview day for the big expansions, called Disneyland 59. The $6 million project introduced some classic attractions to the park for the first time: the submarine voyage, Matterhorn Mountain, and of course, the Disney Allweg monorail. The televised debut of this new ride sent a clear message of what the monorail represented, not only for Disneyland, but for America as a whole.
We are the most mobile nation in the world, over a highway system which is the most modern in existence. But cars can be built faster than the highways to take care of them. Wheels are rolling in all directions, and they're all headed for the biggest traffic jam since the wheel was invented. Let's take a look ahead and see what the commuter can hope for in the future. Traffic engineers agree that a monorail system could well be an answer to growing traffic congestion. In large cities where land is at a premium, an aerial monorail system needs only a narrow beamway supported by pylons. The accent is on economy. With the advent of such highways in the sky, the weary commuter will find himself traveling in speed, comfort, and safety. Tomorrow's living areas will expand as the beamways of modern monorail systems begin to crisscross metropolitan centers.
On the surface, the Disneyland monorail was just another amusement park ride. But for transit committees like the MTA, it was a very real preview of the future that was just around the corner. While Disneyland was delighting visitors with its new monorail, the MTA was completing a slightly less thrilling corridor study. This was a huge expansion on the plan from 5 years earlier, now exploring 12 possible transit corridors extending outward through the entire region. This vision would be refined over the following year. The first phase of construction would have 4 transit lines spanning 75 miles. The Long Beach line would now take a more direct route, running above the old tracks of the Pacific Electric. Likewise, the Valley Line would now run along Wilshire Boulevard rather than Sunset, and would end in Reseda rather than Panorama City. A westbound line would split off from this, running through Beverly Hills and out to Santa Monica. An eastbound line would follow the median of the San Bernardino Freeway, running through El Monte and out to Covina. These initial 4 routes could be constructed in about 5 years. Over the next 20 years, another 4 lines would be built as expansions to the system. To the southwest, a line would connect downtown LA with Inglewood and Los Angeles International Airport. To the southeast, a line would run along Interstate 5 as far down as Buena Park. To the northeast, a line would run up to Pasadena and Arcadia. Splitting off this would be a second line up to the valley, serving Glendale, Burbank, and San Fernando. And for good measure, a shortcut would be added to the original Valley Line, providing more direct trips to downtown. Altogether, the result would be a comprehensive transit network spanning 150 miles. In January of 1960, the MTA was approached by Alweg representative Sixton Holmquist. The company made an official offer to build the MTA's proposed system. Their research showed that the Santa Monica line should be built first, as well as the Buena Park line as far as Norwalk. This would be the most profitable part of the system, and would help fund the next phases of construction. Right around this same time, Seattle was having trouble reaching an agreement with Lockheed on the financing of the World's Fair monorail. Alweg took this opportunity to submit a bid of their own. Not only would their system be far less expensive, but they would also finance the whole project themselves, paying off the system with a cut of the ticket sales. Seattle awarded Alweg the contract shortly thereafter. Between the World's Fair and Disneyland, they would soon be responsible for the 2 most prominent monorail projects in the United States. Despite this, the MTA seemed completely disinterested in Alweg's offer for Los Angeles. The truth is, things were getting a bit more complicated. When the MTA had gained their new powers in 1957, this also expanded their purview to any kind of transit system, not just monorail. They had figured out the general routes they wanted to serve, but now they had to figure out whether monorail actually made the most economic sense. The MTA investigated dozens of transit systems, hearing proposals from anybody who had an idea to pitch, and leaving no stone unturned. The LA Times wrote, "Consequently, they have given audiences to everything from backyard inventors to aircraft manufacturers to multi-billion-dollar international syndicates." After reviewing the options, the MTA made a surprising decision. Rather than a monorail, they now preferred a more traditional rail metro system, but equipped with rubber-tired wheels. This was an unusual choice, but this kind of system had already proven successful on the Paris Metro. So why the change? Well, business owners along Wilshire Boulevard were strongly opposed to a monorail running through their district. The MTA now planned to run this portion of the network underground instead. While monorail was the cheapest option for an elevated system, it was far more expensive to build it underground. Metro trains were a bit more flexible for lines that needed to run above and below ground. And using a rubber-tired version of the system would have the added benefits of better traction and reduced running noise. But while this seems like a sound decision from a cost and engineering perspective, it didn't sit right with the people of Los Angeles. With monorail having dominated the conversation for over a decade, the idea of now pursuing a different transit system was fairly controversial. The majority of the network would still need to be elevated, and these bulkier trains would need wider and less visually appealing support structures. Los Angeles had been promised the transit of the future, but this felt like a big step backward. One resident wrote in a letter to the LA Mirror News, "In the plans favored by the MTA engineers, we have probably a 20-foot span or roof over our thoroughfares. We create virtually a tunnel, shutting out light and air, not unlike the grotesque old New York Elevated. Another person shared their concerns with the LA Citizen News, saying, "Chicago has long since eliminated their elevated system in the downtown area. It was impractical because it shut out daylight and was dirty. It was also ugly." Walt Disney's monorail must be most amusing to him, as he compares it with the Dark Ages monstrosity the engineers want to build in Los Angeles. Even the famed science fiction writer, Ray Bradbury, added his voice to the conversation. As a Los Angeles local, he was well aware of the city's need for transit and was an outspoken supporter of the monorail. He suggested that Walt Disney should take over for the MTA and develop the city's transit himself. And for anyone who thought he was joking, he said, "Don't laugh, I am deadly serious about this." In fact, the Disneyland monorail had been so successful that it was now getting a major expansion just 2 years after its debut. The 1-mile loop was extended to about 2.5 miles, running outside the park and leading to a second station at the new Disneyland Hotel. What had started as a simple amusement park ride was now running along city streets, providing a transportation service between the hotel and Disneyland itself. When the updated monorail opened in the summer of 1961, it only emphasized just how little progress the MTA had made. Frustration only grew further when the MTA made another announcement around this same time. Rather than building 4 transit lines spanning 75 miles, they would now focus their efforts on what they called the Backbone Route. This was a 23-mile portion of the original plan, only going as far west as Century City and as far east as El Monte. 12 miles of this route would be underground, acting as a subway for the entire section from downtown to the Wilshire District and Century City. As the name implied, the Backbone Route would be the most heavily used portion of the overall network. By building this section first, the revenues could help fund the construction of the other lines in the future. What's more, the MTA changed their minds again about the type of transit system to be used. Now they promoted stylish, steel-wheeled metro trains rather than the rubber-tired ones. The MTA wasn't very transparent about their thought process here, but the engineering report gives us some further insight. It states that their 2 major goals were to cut the project costs drastically and to eliminate the need for any research and development. This explains why the more conventional steel-wheeled trains were chosen, as the technology was far more matured and cheaper to build. The reason for cutting down the network isn't stated outright, but with the ballooning cost of building more of the line underground, this was likely just a way to lower the overall price tag. Understandably, the public was disappointed with these drastic cutbacks. The Backbone Route was only a third of what was promised just a year earlier. It would mostly serve people living in the more upscale neighborhoods of the West Side, who were less likely to use transit in the first place. High-density areas like the San Fernando Valley, which needed transit more urgently, had been cut out of the plans entirely. As stated by City Councilman Everett Burkhalter, the valley is badly in need of mass transportation, much worse than the area this MTA plan proposes to serve. Likewise, communities that were cut from the plan were given no warning. City officials in Covina said, "There was no discussion with the city regarding the sudden change in planning. We were not even consulted." For many people, the Backbone Route represented everything that was wrong with the MTA. They were supposed to be serving the public, but they kept making these sweeping decisions without any public input. People were getting more fed up by the day, but things would only continue to get worse. Shortly after the MTA revealed their plans for the Backbone Route, Sixton Holmquist approached them for a second time. He proposed that Allweg could build it as a monorail line, at a fraction of the cost of the Metro rail system. But for reasons that are unclear, Allweg suggested the route should be even shorter. Their monorail would only run 14 miles between downtown Los Angeles and Westwood. Even more controversial was their plan to run it right through the middle of Wilshire Boulevard. This seemed a bit tone-deaf, given that the district had already been very clear that this was out of the question. Peter Giannini with the Wilshire Chamber of Commerce said, "The MTA has a responsibility to the people who have spent millions improving their buildings along Wilshire Boulevard. It's shocking to think of elevated transit running down the center of a prime avenue in the United States. Wilshire Boulevard cannot afford to be a guinea pig for this plan." The MTA rejected Allweg's offer a month later, reminding them that they had to make choices that were acceptable to the community. But even though the plan was flawed, some officials felt that it was dismissed too quickly. County Supervisor Kenneth Hahn was among the most outspoken supporters of the monorail, and he personally kept an open dialogue with Allweg in the coming months. In March of 1962, he and a few other LA officials traveled up to Seattle to meet with Sixton Holmquist and to get a first-hand look at the World's Fair monorail that was nearing completion. Unlike the setup at Disneyland, this was a real public transit system that ran entirely over city streets. The LA officials were fascinated with the system. Airport Commissioner David Robinson said, "This is much smoother than I ever dreamed. Look at those windows, lots of light. This certainly has the subway beaten, particularly for Southern California." A month later, on April 21, 1962, Seattle's Century 21 Exposition opened to the public.
Next to the Space Needle, probably the best-known symbol on the fairgrounds, the symbol of the fair, is the monorail. While admittedly not every exhibit is completely finished in time for today's opening, the monorail is one thing in the fair that has been ready with a lot to spare. One train has already carried more than 16,000 passengers in a single day. Both trains, one red and one blue, will take much more than twice that number on many days during the next 6 months. It requires just a little over a minute and a half to ride from the Westlake Mall in the heart of the city to the World's Fair Terminal across the street from the Space Needle on the fairgrounds. It's an exciting ride, but more than that, it is an operating transit system. And transportation officials from all over the United States are showing great interest in what's going on here because they theorize that this might just be the answer or part of the answer to the many traffic congestion problems of urban areas.
While the monorail had been somewhat of a gamble, it proved to be a huge hit with visitors. The system was so successful that it was able to pay for itself by the end of the summer. Disneyland may have proven the monorail's success in amusement parks, but Seattle proved its worth in a real-life setting of public transit. For the people of Los Angeles, this was just further proof that a more expensive subway didn't make any sense. City Councilman Lemoyne Blanchard said, "For a city which has always prided itself on its sunshine and natural beauty, it is unthinkable to assume that people would want to travel underground in a black tunnel like Gophers. The valley needs rapid transit now, so why not build a monorail system to the valley and the airport harbor areas and forget Wilshire Boulevard for the moment?" On the subject of the airport, there had been talks for a while now to build the airport line as its own separate system. County Supervisor Kenneth Hahn and City Councilman L.E. Timberlake took it upon themselves to study this idea. They figured they could make faster progress if they didn't have to worry about what the MTA was doing elsewhere. The MTA did eventually take over for this project though, and they had some productive conversations with the Goodell Monorail Company. Goodell had gained some attention back in 1956, when they built the first commercial monorail in the United States. Named the Trailblazer, this was a short demonstration track at the State Fair in Dallas, Texas, predating the Disneyland system by 3 years. For the airport line, Goodell proposed a route that would run east above Century Boulevard. Then it would turn north and run along the middle of the Harbor Freeway, soon reaching the other terminus in downtown. Suspended pods would whisk passengers along at 90 miles per hour, running between the airport and downtown in about 12 minutes. The idea was generally well received, with Governor Pat Brown saying it was very exciting and calling it a breakthrough in their transit problems. The MTA envisioned the airport line as a non-stop trip, but Kenneth Hahn, who had promoted the idea in the first place, felt this didn't make any sense. He argued that there should be additional stops to serve the neighborhoods it would run through. County Supervisor Frank Bonelli agreed, calling the project a special gravy train run that would give preferential benefits to airlines rather than solve the city's transit problems. A local resident wrote in a letter to the LA Times, "This would be a great convenience to the folks who fly in for a few days at a time. But how about the poor workers trying to get back and forth from their homes to work in Los Angeles? None of us would mind paying the bill if we had rapid transit where it is needed. Long Beach, eastern towns, and the Valley." And this was the problem. The MTA had spent the last 2 years so focused on specific areas like the Wilshire District and the airport that it was completely ignoring the transit needs of LA County as a whole. Needless to say, these issues were highly contentious among politicians and the general public alike. In the words of the Valley Times, monorail, as viewed by the Los Angeles Metropolitan Transit Authority, is an elevated nightmare of bad publicity. Staying true to character, the MTA made yet another big announcement in January of 1963. In response to the backlash over their fragmented planning, they now presented a compromise. Rather than limiting the project to the backbone route, they would build about 2/3 of the original plan. This would have 58 miles of rail transit lines running to North Hollywood, Century City, El Monte, and Long Beach. But as always, there was a catch. The system would cost $649 million, or about $6 billion today. And this enormous cost would have to be paid for by the people of Los Angeles through a new property tax. The MTA didn't have the power to impose taxes, but they started pushing for new legislation that would allow them to do just that. The most troubling part was that they wanted to impose taxes without any approval from voters. These announcements went over about as well as you'd expect. Kenneth Hahn criticized the new transit plan, saying, "There is nothing new in this whole report. It is just a rehashing of old plans, with a new method of financing to sock the little homeowner." Governor Pat Brown actually supported the property tax, and criticized the county supervisors for getting in the way. Supervisor Frank Bonelli retorted that this was so much irresponsible hogwash, reminding the governor that it was their responsibility to protect the people from more taxes, especially ones that they had no control over. A local resident wrote in a letter to the LA Times, "This tax is an unnecessary waste and ridiculous planning on the part of the MTA. It could be easily summed up in one simple statement: use of public funds with lack of public interest." Amidst all the controversy, Alweg made its third and final attempt to help Los Angeles solve its problems. In June of 1963, Sixton Holmquist made an offer to finance and construct a 42-mile monorail system. Similar to the MTA's most recent proposal, this would have a line running up to Van Nuys, another running out to El Monte, and a third running out to Westwood. The cost? $187.5 million, or about $1.7 billion today. In other words, Alweg would build most of the MTA's proposed network, for a third of the cost, and it would be fully financed with no taxes necessary. Between this and Goodell's earlier commitment to finance the airport line, the people of Los Angeles couldn't have asked for a better deal. To the MTA's credit, they did finally bring the public into the conversation. A series of public hearings were held, where citizens were able to give feedback on specific route alignments through their neighborhoods. The Long Beach Independent wrote, "One of the most encouraging facets of the meeting was just the fact that it was held. It appears now that the MTA is going to bring the public into its advanced planning." People seemed cautiously optimistic that things might finally be turning around for the better. But on September 23, 1963, the MTA shattered these expectations. They announced that they were officially rejecting both the Alweg and Goodell monorail offers outright. Despite the recent progress, the MTA held firm that a conventional rail system would be superior to monorail. They also criticized the companies for their offers of private financing, claiming it would be impossible for projects of this scale. Community leaders, the press, and the general public were angered by this reckless behavior. County Supervisor Ernest Debs said, "I'm dismayed by the MTA's action. This type of public relations by the MTA is not conducive to building a rapid transit system here." ALWIG spokesman William Ross said, "The Metropolitan Transit Authority has committed suicide and will soon be going out of business. The state legislature created the MTA, and they can also do away with it." Even Ray Bradbury chimed in, saying, "We put ourselves in the Metropolitan Transit Authority's hands, and they destroyed the only rapid transit we had." Amidst the uproar, Senator Tom Rees introduced a bill that would abolish the MTA entirely. He proposed that it be replaced with a new board called the Southern California Rapid Transit District, or RTD. This larger board would better represent the communities of LA County, with the goal of being more accountable to the public. He said, "Any board charged with developing a rapid transit system should be more responsive to the people. The Metropolitan Transit Authority, whose members are appointed by the governor, are not." In May of 1964, 8 months after the MTA's controversial rejection, the RTD bill was signed into law. As the LA Times put it, "Faulty and ineffectual, the Los Angeles Metropolitan Transit Authority will reach the end of the line in August. The legislature and Governor Brown have signed its death certificate." 13 years had passed since the MTA was established, and they had nothing to show for it but a fleet of buses. The population of LA County had grown by nearly 50% in this time, yet not a single inch of rapid transit had been built. Despite the widespread support, the dream of a monorail for Los Angeles would never fully recover. After years of anticipation, controversy, confusion, broken promises, and rejection, the transit of the future quickly faded into the bitter memories of the past. The story of the monorail's failure in Los Angeles is nothing if not incredibly complex. People have speculated for decades why the MTA would make such a fatal decision, not only for the monorail, but for itself. The most popular theory suggests that there was actually a sinister motive, that General Motors and Standard Oil pressured the MTA to kill the monorail project. This is a pretty obvious callback to the streetcar conspiracy of the 1940s. But is this really what happened? Some sources claim that this may have been the case, but I haven't personally found any hard evidence to support this. That doesn't necessarily mean it didn't happen though, and I think it's worth some consideration. The history of these corporations' influence on American politics is a whole conversation in itself. But suffice to say, it's certainly not implausible that they could have been involved. Let's not forget that from 1957 onward, the MTA was first and foremost a bus company. In this capacity, they had ongoing contracts with General Motors and Standard Oil. It's also worth pointing out that some of the MTA board members felt strongly that buses were a superior form of transit, and they weren't shy about their disdain for monorail. These details don't actually prove anything, but they could suggest some political influence behind the scenes. With all that said, the theory isn't watertight. The MTA stated outright that they were rejecting the monorail in favor of a subway. General Motors and Standard Oil weren't exactly in favor of rail systems either, so it seems dubious that they would be pulling the strings for that decision. Also, it's not like the MTA changed their tone overnight. They had largely written off monorail a few years earlier. In a way, the idea of the monorail being killed off by big corporations almost feels unnecessary. The MTA seemed more than happy to pull the trigger themselves. It's easy to cast blame on a secret villain, or to write off the MTA's behavior as simply incompetent, but I think it's far more nuanced than that. Developing transit on this scale would be a massive challenge even in the best conditions. But the MTA was never given much authority to actually implement its own plans in the first place. Years of political infighting wore down their patience too, as they only became more stubborn and aggressive over time. If they had taken a more amiable approach and involved the public in the planning process, this could have gone a long way toward their own success. So if Los Angeles didn't get a monorail system, what did it get instead? Well, after the MTA's rejection, it would be another 26 years before light rail would finally arrive. The first line opened in 1990, and the network has gradually expanded in the years since. New proposals for a monorail line seem to crop up every decade or two. But for everything that's changed in the last 60 years, this idea has remained as controversial as ever. Whether a monorail should be built is a different conversation entirely. But no matter how LA's transit develops, one thing is certain. It'll never live up to the 1960s vision of the future. Then again, that's kind of how the future works. It's a destination that's always just out of reach. A constantly evolving goal to strive for. A promise for a better tomorrow. And as it was once said, tomorrow is just a dream away.
There's a great, big, beautiful tomorrow, shining at the end of every day. There's a great, big, beautiful tomorrow, and tomorrow's just a dream away. Man has a dream, and that's the start. He follows his dream with mind and heart. And when it becomes a reality, it's a dream come true for you and me. So there's a great, big, beautiful tomorrow, shining at the end of every day. There's a great, big, beautiful tomorrow, just a dream away.